Early reporting indicates that Ukraine's attack into the Kursk region of Russia is vastly more successful than anyone expected. Just why is Ukraine able to brush aside Russian defenses? What is Russia doing to try to stabilize it? And why is it not actually that big a surprise for anybody? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is the current update map that's gone down in the last maybe 24 hours. And as you can see, they're marking as fully liberated a fairly large swath of territory in the Kursk region. And you can see that while there is considerable advances that have been made, you're also seeing some artillery strikes, right, purportedly outside of this kind of locus of control. So I think this is, and this looks like it was updated only around 7 hours ago. So in the last 8 hours, we've seen a flurry of activity, including Putin convening a meeting of his Security Council, and the mandatory evacuation of many communities of Sumy, right, likely in anticipation of further Russian responses. But why is this actually? There's more reporting that indicates, at least, that the actual depth of the Ukrainian advance, as yet unconfirmed, is much deeper. You can see this speculative map, and let's take this with the grain of salt that it deserves. But it would involve a much larger swath of territory, including a large number of villages, I think up to 11 by one count. When we zoom out here, let's see if we can find it on the map. Actually, let's do the combat map here, because that's going to be easier to kind of orient around. So you could see here that actually this looks just about right along this this map here. It looks like you got the initial locus of control advancing all the way towards these reservoirs, but then a further contested region as Ukraine reinforces its personnel. So I think they're arguing that it's held up to here and that this is kind of the larger region. So I think this is broadly accurate. What some reports is that it includes 11 villages and up to 15 kilometers into Kursk. Bear in mind, guys, that the entirety of the Russian offensive effort in the Donbas, right? And we zoom in here. What you're looking at is, let's see, there's about 7 kilometers is pretty much the advance that we've seen from Ultradetina last year till now. So this is a pretty significant advance to happen overnight, particularly into Russian territory. Now, the reports from the Russian forces, now these are leaked Telegram statements, so take them with a grain of salt, right? We should caveat that. But some of the reporting sounds pretty dire. The Kursk region says, this is from Russia. Our aircraft and UAVs worked all night. Enemy, that's Ukrainian. Concentrations being destroyed. But they said Ukrainians are deploying logistics in this controlled territories, bringing in fuel and ammunition. That's an indicator, if true, that this is more than just a raid, right? This isn't like the Freedom of Russia Legion pushing into Gray-Voron for brief periods of time. This means their intent is likely to hold this for some time, all right? It says, judging by open sources, enemy troops are present at a depth of up to 15 kilometers. The width of the front is 10 to 11 kilometers. So again, up to 15 kilometers of depth. Likely you're looking at probably 7 kilometers of actual liberated turf. Armed Forces of Ukraine, right, present in, and it lists all the villages, 11 settlements in total. They say the Russian army is striking back and our infantry is working, and they're evacuating the population, right? Here's another brief from the Russian side, a different Telegram channel, who's saying, quote, by nighttime became evident we can't push enemy forces from our territory. Aviation strikes were effective during the day, but became inefficient because of enemy anti-aircraft, right? Ukraine deploying anti-aircraft to cover this newly cleared territory, right? One town being evacuated, local population, government workers. It said during the last 24 hours, they took out 16 Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles, as well as 2 Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles. But it said all day and night, both sides bringing up reserves. the enemy is in this case, Ukrainians attempting to destabilize the situation on different parts of the front. Lists out another series of villages by nightfall. Very tough situation, right, is what the Russians are describing. It says the regions are held by 150 to 200 Ukrainian soldiers and 15 armored pieces. Coming 24 hours will be tough. It says enemy has a motorized infantry battalion in action, up to 2,000 people in the second echelons, skillfully using drones, anti-aircraft, and electronic warfare. Very interesting stuff. And I want to make 2 points, guys. The first of which is if you want to check out some of the fighting, the footage coming out of this fight, that is only for members. YouTube won't let me show you any kind of combat footage. So when I get that footage, I do the analysis on combatvetnews.com. Also, if you appreciate the fact that I am totally independent, I'm not beholden to any major media outlet. I'm not beholden to saying things that sponsors will like. That's because I have you guys to support me over on combatvetnews.com. If you want to get access to those uncensored combat videos, they drop twice a week. The footage in this case is, when I dropped it yesterday, was like 2 hours old. That's for the specialist tier. That'll get you access. But if you want to get the weekly Q&As, which we're doing Thursday, that is for Lieutenant tier and above. And of course, if you want the by name shout outs and to really support the channel, that's the Colonel tier. So check us out, combatvetnews.com. But also, if you want to support that motor infantry battalion that's causing the Russians to sweat so bad, we've partnered with Ukraine Adops, who I want to point out sent me a text 3 days ago, and it was very what's the word I want? It was a little cryptic. Because usually we collab, they give me a heads up, they'll tell me about the unit, they're like, here's our next fundraiser. And this time they just said, fundraiser for the 22nd is open. That was the message. And I was like, that's kind of weird, guys. And then 2 days later, they said, well, actually, it's because the 22nd is fighting in Kursk, and we couldn't say anything. So now we can. These guys are in Kursk, and their drone battalion is asking for help. They're looking for FPV drones, a Mavic, of course, EcoFlows and generators, Starlinks, drone jammers, and signal repeaters, right, to extend those control signals into Russia. So, of course, guys, if you want to check them out, I'm going to link to this in the description as well. You can see we're 3/4 of the way to our goal, which is badass. And these guys are definitely going to appreciate it. It's best of all, it's a 501c3 registered in the US. It's tax deductible. And that's because you notice none of these things are arms, are like offensive weapon systems. So that's why they're a 501c3. And again, I've donated. I'm on the wall there, but they've got a bunch of swag if you make those donations. So the link will be in the description. Huge thank you to these guys for collabing and doing the hard part, man. Like going in there, linking your PayPal. That's easy. I do the easy part. These guys are gonna have to haul these drones out to the 22nd, and boy, the 22nd has the real hard part of fighting and seizing Russian territory. Kidding aside, that it's gone much easier, I think, than anyone expected. Now, let's talk about why this strategy actually it shouldn't surprise us that much, and that there's even more of a little bit of an angle to this that I think is pretty interesting. First, you may have noticed that in the early days of this invasion, or the early hours, we're still in the early days of this incursion, Ukrainian Sukhois were able to operate pretty much with impunity. And the reason is because Ukraine has been preparing for this for a long time. You notice that they keep targeting the Kerch Bridge and some of the ferries around it. And as a result, and they keep targeting Russian air defense assets in the Crimean Peninsula, right? This meant that Russia increasingly had to pull its air defense systems like Buk-2s or S-400s or S-300s out of other places and move them to Crimea, right? To defend this crucial Kerch Bridge. That likely, Ukrainian intelligence likely detected that these sources had been pulled, these air defenses had been sourced from probably the Kursk region. which meant that now Ukrainian fixed-wing aircraft could finally operate in actual close air support of their troops. And once they were able to own the skies, even for a couple hours, it became a really different fight. Again, once Ukraine owns the skies, they're talking 7-8 kilometers of depth, easy for them to penetrate into Russian territory. Now, the other thing that I thought was real, that I think is very interesting, is that there's been a lot of reports that the Russians are encountering, or the Ukrainians, excuse me, are encountering Russian conscripts. And what's fascinating about this is that Russian conscripts, you might recall, are officially, legally not allowed to be used in Ukraine. Russia has refused to use, Russia has a conscription system where every able-bodied male is supposed to serve, but most wealthy or middle-class Russians find pretty easy ways to get out of it. But these conscripts are forbidden from fighting outside of Russia. They exist solely to defend Russian territory, which means that for the first time, Russian conscripts are actually in this fight. And that, on the surface, seems like a problem, right? That you're actually drawing in more Russian combat power. But one, these conscripts have likely very little motivation to fight. And that's what we've seen. We've seen a lot of them flee. A lot of them are surrendering with little resistance. A lot of them aren't really that trained because, again, conscripts are not the primary source of combat power for the Russian armed forces. The conscripts who never got great training to begin with are getting even worse training. And so they're sitting there in these regions. But you may ask yourself the question that a lot of people are asking, which is, hey, if Russia has all these conscripts, why aren't they just creating why isn't Putin just doing a draft, just saying, conscripts, we are going to put you in the fight? He can. He's Vladimir Putin. He runs Russia. The reason is because it would be incredibly, unbelievably unpopular for Putin to have to take conscripts, everybody la-di-da-di, every able-bodied male, and put them in the fight in Ukraine. Right? The reason the Russian public can stomach a lot of the Ukraine casualties is because it's frankly someone else's kid getting killed. Right? Again, you're talking about the general Russian public is not subject to the risks and realities of this conflict. Instead, the only way the conflict kind of reaches them is through rising prices and occasional increases in taxes as the government funds their war effort. Right? But now Ukraine has said, Putin, if you don't want to draft your people because it's so unpopular, because they don't want to be in this fight, we're going to force them into this fight. We're going to force you to have to put your conscripts, your average workaday Russian, slightly below average, working Russian, into this fight. And that, I think, is actually kind of brilliant. Because again, before, Russia is bringing in, I think, 300,000 to 400,000 new conscripts every single semi-annual conscription cycle. And that means that basically every one of those families was like, you won't serve in Ukraine. They would probably tell them, don't sign a contract. When your time is up, after you've served your 12 months or whatever, just come back and, I don't know, work on the family farm or whatever. But now every one of those families is going, shit. This war in Ukraine that I don't really give a shit about, that's somebody else's problem, that volunteers are fighting, no longer. Now, potentially, my son is going to be on the receiving end of an FPV drone, of a ATACMS, of a HIMARS. It's a bad situation for the Russian public. And it's one of the reasons that you would think that Putin, of all people, Mr. Red Line himself, would be out there being like, this is an uncrossable red line. But no, he hasn't said dick. He literally had a National Security Council meeting. He made one oblique reference to the regime in Kyiv, and that's it. Weird, right? He said the F-16s were an uncrossable red line, but literally crossing into Russia isn't. And it's because obviously his red lines are nonsense, and it's because the reality is that he doesn't want word to get out to the Russian public Your conscripts, by the way, they're just as likely to get killed by a Ukrainian drone as the convicts that we have been throwing into this meat grinder for the last year and a half. So it's gonna be a very tough situation for Putin, who both has lost territory, embarrassing, and finds himself, having to tell a bunch of Russian families, hey, those conscripts that definitely weren't fighting in Ukraine just got killed by Ukrainians. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. A huge thank you to the Colonel tier members of CombatVetNews.com. Could not do this without you guys, particularly Bill Collier, Robin Coburn, Kars Marning, Eugenia Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, and Fran Zacharias, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. You guys really are the ones who make this whole thing possible. I appreciate you so much, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Those things help. Cheers.